Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello again, welcome back to the Fighting on Film podcast. This week we are joined by a very special guest, historian Robert Lyman. You may know him from his recent book, A War of Empires, that charts the story of the war in the Far East in the Second World War, and his 2004 book, Slim Master of War. So what better film for us to cover today than 1961's The Long and the Short and the Tall? Robert, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Fabulous to be with you both today.
Brilliant. So it's a Richard Todd and Richard Harris picture. And Matt, I think you were going to start off with cast this week.
Absolutely. It's a real classic ensemble of British actors of the period, isn't it? As you said there, we've got Richard Todd and Richard Harris up there. Classic British character actors. And then we also have Laurence Harvey as well, who's the loudmouth Private Bamford. So Richard Todd's character is Sergeant Mitchum, and he's leading the patrol. And he's best known for Dam Busters, Yangtze incidents, which we've already covered, and The Longest Day, of course, and numerous other films, lots of non-war films. Richard Harris plays Corporal Johnston, who's a professional soldier, I would say, from the way he speaks. And he first appeared in 1961 as Squadron Leader Barnsby in the Guns of Navarone. He was in the Mutiny on the Bounty. He was Major Dundee he was in Major Dundee, US Civil War film. Here is a telemark, most famously, Cromwell, and of course the Wild Geese. The other principal of the ensemble piece is probably Laurence Harvey, who plays Bamford, and he appeared in Storm Over the Nile in 1955, Four Feathers adaptation. The Silent Enemy in 1958, and then perhaps most famously, he was William Travis in The Alamo in 1960 with John Wayne. And then rounding out the cast, we've got Ronald Fraser, who's in Too Late the Hero, another Far East war movie in 1970. He was Private Campbell in The Paper Tiger with David Niven in 1975. He plays a veteran in a museum. He was Jock McTaggart in The Wild Geese. And there's David McCallum, who plays the radio operator, Private Whitaker. He debuted in Ill Met by Moonlight in 1957. That was his first uncredited role. He was also famously Eric Ashley Pitt in the Great Escape. John Malayan plays Private Smith. He was in On the Beach, a Cold War movie adapted from Neville Shute's book. He was also in The Longest Day as an uncredited Rear Admiral Alan Kirk. He was Flight Lieutenant Gillibrand in 633 Squadron, and probably most famously, although he was also in Guns of Batazi, he's probably best known for being Wally in the Crocodile Dundee movies. Quite a character in those. And then we have John Reese, who was Private Evans, and he was in lots of TV work. He was in the odd 80s film Sky Bandits, which is like a Wild West crossover with World War One. Very, very unusual film.
Yeah, that film is bizarre,
isn't it? It really is. And he was also a German sergeant in Raiders of the Lost Ark. So he had bit parts later on in his career, but actually quite interested in this. It's quite a lot to do. And then we have Kenji Takaki, who is one of the chaps that were in the original play that the film is based on. He plays the character known as Tojo in the credits of the film, and he's an unnamed private first class of the Imperial Japanese Army. And he had lots of credits in playing Asian roles in lots of films. He was 66 at the time of filming, actually, so he's quite old for a Japanese Army private, I would say, wouldn't you?
Yes, although in those days, of course, soldiers were long service soldiers, but 66 years pretty old. Although in the film, you can't tell that he's older than usual. But he didn't look too old to be to fit the part. I thought he was a really, really good actor.
I agree,
and played it really well.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
He was previously in The Camp on Blood Island and 55 Days at Peking, and he also appeared with Stanley Baker in The Last Grenade as well. Which is a mercenary film, which we may cover at some point. A couple of the others, the Japanese soldiers which appear at the end have some interesting credits. You have Anthony Chin and Andy Ho, and they were also in films like Camp on Blood Island, The Yangtze Incident, a couple of Bond films between them, and 55 Days at Peking and The Planter's Wife as well. one of the few Malaya films.
Yeah.
Malayan emergency films. And that basically rounds out the cast, but it's very interesting. It's got a very strong cast, and Peter O'Toole had originally played the Bamford character in the West End production. His understudy for the West End production was Michael Caine, but he never went on. But he did do the Scottish tour. So I think it would have been really interesting to have had either of those in the film itself.
Robert Shaw plays Todd's character as well. The names they could have picked from, I mean, obviously at the time, they're not massive stars at the time. Obviously, Shaw would find fame later on in his career, but the cast is just powerhouse, isn't it? It's one of those movies, I think it's almost a little bit not as well remembered as I think as the play.
Perhaps the studio-bound nature of it,
I think so,
takes away from that, maybe.
Yeah, so I don't actually think it worked as well as they intended. And I think one of the problems with having such a stellar cast, I mean, if every single one of your actors is going to be, in the top quartile of performers, perhaps not then, but later, they're all well-trained actors. The opportunity of them clashing together and not bringing out the best of the story is an issue. I think actually that's what happens here. I think what would have been a better thing for the producer to do was to have a couple of big names, because I felt as the film went on, I really got irritated with a little bit of the overacting. So the real challenge here is that each of the individuals has to express their personality. So there's a quiet type, there's a very thick type, there's a very barrack room lawyer type, there's Bamford, there's a really tough sergeant type, and there's a cocky corporal, who's responsible for irritating everybody. I mean, and they almost overact, and by doing that, they lose one of the key facets of military efficiency, which is teamwork. So there is no teamwork from the moment they set out on this patrol to the time they finish it. It's just a complete disaster. So you can get a sense of that happening. But, they're great actors, but I just think it didn't really help the film. I think it would have helped the play. I think the play would have been a very different thing. But, constrained in that particular box is very difficult. And it's very interesting reading some of the stories from the filming. I mean, people just didn't get on with each other, did they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean that's perfect, because I'll cover the production very quickly now. But yeah, there's some fantastic stories from on set. So yes, as we mentioned before, it was based on the hit 1959 play by Willis Hall, and the film rights were bought in the same year. And it was turned into a feature film by Michael Balcon Productions, and he also served as the movie's producer. And it was also produced by the Associated British Picture Corporation, who also helped produce The Dam Busters with Richard Todd as Guy Gibson and Ice Cold and Alex. And the film was released by Warner Pathé on the 17th of February 1961 in the UK. It's directed by Leslie Norman, who's perhaps best known for directing Dunkirk in 1958, and he produced The Cruel Sea in 1953. His son Barry Norman, obviously, is well known from the film BBC film review show. Cinematography was by Irwin Hillier. He also acted as DOP on The Dam Busters as well. There's a nice link there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. The play was adapted by Wolf Mankiewicz, who also wrote screenplays for The Day the Earth Caught Fire and the David Niven version of Casino Royale. And the movie was filmed entirely within Elstree Studios. But it was gripped, as Rob was mentioning there, gripped with issues between Richard Harris and Richard Todd, because they resented each other's political views. And the fact that Peter O'Toole was recast for Laurence Harvey really irked Richard Todd. And he later said in an interview, "I didn't enjoy working with Laurence Harvey. I took it for granted they would cast Peter O'Toole, who was marvellous on stage, but they said they wanted a name."
Well, there we go.
Yeah,
Yes.
and we have a retro review this week, and this time it's not from the Daily Mirror. Oh gosh, I hear you cry at home listening in. But this time it's from Variety. And it says, director and scriptwriter have not been able to resist the temptation to take a great deal of Willis Hall's war play into the open air of the jungle. This is a pity. It loses the sense of pent-in suspense that marked the play so effectively. And it shows up the fact that Elstree jungle is rather phony.
Oh, that's absolutely fabulous, because my fundamental criticism of the film, as I've said to you earlier, Robbie, is there is no drama. There's no sense of impending doom. And the film, and I wonder whether this is Norman, doesn't really understand the context of the film, because if he had got it right, it would have been a stonker. Because the Japanese, remember the Japanese, and remember this is not Burma, this is Malaya, January 1942. So the Japanese had been in Malaya for 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks' time, they'd be in Singapore, and Singapore would fall on the 15th of February. Willis Hall gets this absolutely right, but I don't think the producer understands it. So what you need to have is huge amounts of impending doom, terror. The Japanese are charging down from the north. They're very close, if not surrounding the positions now. They're a byword for brutality. All the British soldiers have been trained to understand what the Japanese have done in China. It's not a mystery to them. They understand how the Japanese treat prisoners brutally, how fierce they fight. And all the news coming out of northern Malaya for those 3 weeks is one of British and Commonwealth failure, retreat, disaster, lots of horrible stories about massacres coming through as well. Now, that should have been the backdrop to this film. And I think that's where it was missed. That sense of drama all the way through. He tried to artificially create it. And for me, it didn't work. I mean, I've read somewhere that it worked in the play, because people knew what was happening. In a film, many, many years later, you need to understand the context, and it's not laid out for us. So I think that's the biggest letdown for me.
Agree.
Yeah, we only get the very briefest of hints of any sort of jeopardy, because McLeish, Ronald Fraser's character, talks about having a kid brother in the Highlanders.
Yes.
And they're up on the line. And there seems to be, amongst all of the chaps, there's no real sense of impending oncoming enemy attack.
Yeah, that's right.
Obviously, 3 weeks into that campaign is completely inaccurate, and it was a fight in retreat all the way down the peninsula. So
yeah, and the reason why that's a problem for me, and I think it lets the film down, is because the film is fundamentally a morality tale. It's about how you treat the enemy,
absolutely,
and whether it's right or proper to take a life in cold blood. And it's a very interesting dynamic. It's a very interesting conversation to have. The answers are really simple. The British military tradition, in fact, the Western military tradition, is based firmly on developed notions of military law, the law of war, and it's illegal to take a life in cold blood. And that's what the play's trying to create a conversation around that. But it fails because there's no jeopardy at the start. If they knew that the Japanese routinely bayoneted prisoners, as they did, without a second thought, then that would have been a fantastic backdrop to what do we do? Do we stay? Do we protect ourselves? Do we take Tojo back with us? What do we do? Do we actually do to Tojo what they do to us? That would have been a fabulous conversation to have, but no one had it. And I think that was such a letdown.
The closest we get to that is the talk over the cigarette case, and they seem more shocked that they would loot from dead British soldiers than they would be about how they were treating them.
Yes.
I think that is, I can understand that, but I mean, it's a soldier's lot. Soldiers do tend to take things off enemies, whether they're prisoners or dead. There's a long history of that.
There is.
So that's an interesting point, but they never discuss. It's always sort of ethereal around, oh, well, they were dead when they took that cigarette case, or if it was taken from a British soldier, or, that scene's, and it's a great scene because there's lots of interaction, and it flips on itself a number of times where Bamford counterposes that perhaps he bought it from somewhere and all this. But that scene's great character-wise, but it lacks a little bit in that the substance of the context of the situation.
And it would have made, I agree entirely with that, it would have made a much, much better scene had the backdrop been this conversation around, had Tojo bayoneted a British soldier to take the cigarette case. So that jeopardy that you described just wasn't there. And I mean, it's very interesting. I was thinking, sitting there, having been a soldier, and if I was presented with that, I would say precisely what I've just presented. There is no fear, adrenaline, worry, jeopardy, and soldiers talk about these things. Of course, it's a natural thing to talk about. But it's I mean, I think the one thing the film did get right, if I'm allowed to leap ahead, is
Sure.
I'm criticizing it because actually it could have done so much better. Actually, as an aside, it's a great film. It's a few years after it was produced. It was in the top 6 or 7 films in Britain. So it went down very well. So it would have gone down well with veterans and all the rest of it. But it could have been so much better.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, and it, really good films from that era, military and otherwise, are often remade. And yet we've never really had a remake of this film. And I think we could absolutely have it. And I think there are some really good films that could be made in the context of today's conflicts and the conflicts of the last 20 years. How do you deal with prisoners or engaging in battle in cold blood as opposed to hot blood? And that's a real challenge for
all the
film.
Questions counterinsurgency brings up.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that was fantastic. We usually never spin off from the review, but that was fantastic. So as our newish feature, if you've listened to the show recently, we ask our listeners for their one-word reviews, and we've got a few this week. Dominic Suave says tremendous. Gary Patterson says outstanding, and Dissecting World says theatrical. And I think they all kind of sum up the mood of the film.
Theatrical certainly works.
Theatrical is a good one, yes.
Because that's one of my criticisms. I'll say it early, that I do feel like it is too penned in. It feels like they can't work out whether they want to film the play or whether they want to have it more as an epic. Like, I felt it could have been them on the move, retreating from the Japanese, and then somehow bump into Tojo and have to deal with him on the retreat. And you would have had the impending doom there of, well, look, if we don't stop, we can't stop to deal with this guy, because if we do, we're going to get overrun by the oncoming force. The fact it's studio bound really affects the movie for me.
I'm going to bring in this point about jeopardy again. There is no sense of urgency in them. They're a patrol, have gone out, they're sort of hanging around. If they knew that the Japanese were coming, breathing down their necks, as indeed they were, they could have picked up their stuff and headed back home and had all the arguments. I think you're absolutely right, and they didn't. And that's it's a bit of a failure for me, actually. But I think they were constrained by the fact they were in a studio. You could see the same shot many, many times, and I saw the same rock about 6 times because
that's what Norman said. He said, it was very claustrophobic shooting in the studio at times.
Sometimes that can work well with jungle-based films, where you get that the claustrophobic feel of being very, confined by foliage and trees. But in this case, it doesn't really. But if we compare it to other plays that have been adapted into films, we could compare it to Journey's End, which is another bit of a morality play in which it takes that concept of a group of men in a room, essentially with Journey's End a dugout, and it does it very well. And you get a little, especially the most recent adaptation, it gives you a little bit of exterior within the actual trench itself, and it does that quite well. But with the element of them having to move into the tin mine and then move out of the tin mine, I think that breaks it out of that one room.
Yes, I think that's very good. I think an aside to that point is the fact that I'm not a filmmaker, but I've watched lots of films. You want to, as a filmmaker, I think, determine whether you're going to work hard on the characters and make them big and let them dominate what's happening, or you focus on the conversation, the narrative. And the problem here is we've got both. And we've got some really big characters who are arguing and forcing their personalities on each other. And it's actually unconvincing. And this is another little challenge I've got with the film. And otherwise, a brilliant film, brilliant concept. But, to anyone who's been in the military, teamwork's fundamental, but also your respect for authority and your respect for the job that individuals have to do is paramount. Otherwise, the whole patrol will fall apart. That patrol fell apart, within 5 minutes of leaving base.
Pretty quick,
and it's just not realistic for everyone to be, for Johnson to be arguing with Mitch, and for Todd, Sergeant Mitchell, played by Todd, allowing Bamford, the backroom lawyer, to get away with things. He would have been thumped very hard at the start and said, if you say another word on this patrol, I'm going to put a bayonet in you myself. And you couldn't do that because the function of the film was to be able to argue amongst each other. I just think there could have been a smarter way of allowing the team. It's a really, really tough gig. I accept that. When you've got a sergeant, a corporal, lance corporal, and a couple of privates, all who have to fit into that military hierarchy. But it was artificial. I mean, those sort of relationships just don't exist, and in any small team. And I think the film really, really struggled to get over that.
Maybe if they'd have all been privates and there was no structure,
I think that's right.
That would have worked.
And then you have the power of the argument, the narrative playing through. I think it was very smart not having an officer, by the way. I think this is all soldiers, or other ranks rather. And I think so. You didn't have what did exist in those days was quite a significant, less so during the war and as the decades went on, less of a significant social divide between officers and soldiers.
Because that's what Yesterday's Enemy does. It shows an officer reacting to his own actions, but obviously this movie doesn't. So there's similarities there, but I do agree with you. Not having an officer really helps this film.
Yeah, it does.
To quickly move on to just a rough outline of the plot, the film follows a British sonic deception unit in the jungles of Malaya, and they capture a lone Japanese scout, and this leads to the question of what to do with him and the morality of the situation. Just in case anyone hadn't seen it before going in, we've already spoiled it. It's the nature of the beast. It's an interesting character piece, and it's not really a war film. I know they tacked on those, you can call it an action sequence at the end. They tacked that on for the movie. But I understand in the play version, you don't even see the Japanese army coming on. So at least you get them in this one.
And they did that quite well, actually. I think the final action scenes were really, really well done. And in a few short minutes, they managed to actually depict the tactical superiority of the Japanese in 1942 over the British. I mean, some of the howling mistakes that the British patrol made, like there's no noise control at all, lots of shouting on patrol, and stuff that just doesn't exist in real life.
Just before that scene where they with the cigarette case, Bamford is on sentry duty, and he comes back and no one replaces him, and no one replaces him for the rest of the film.
And remember, he's out there and he shouts back to Mitch about something, and I thought, no, you're a sentry.
I just found it ironic because they're dealing in sonic deception, but yet they're all so bloody loud, and it's ironic. The irony of that is so great. It's some bizarre actions, but I do kind of think at the end that they're fighting for their lives basically, but it all shows the troops as a little bit inept. They come out of cover really easily.
They don't cover themselves with fire. Which the Japanese do brilliantly. I mean, that was very well done. But all those basic tactical mistakes that an experienced British Army sergeant and corporal would never make, but they did. And clearly they're doing it for the purpose of the film, but they just come across as amateurish.
But I think it kind of works because at the start of the movie, they do say they're all volunteers. They volunteered for this unit. I, at least myself, never got the inkling that they'd had any action before. So it could just show, troops totally.
Other than Todd, yeah.
Other than Todd.
Because Todd's described as losing a patrol.
Yes, he is.
Which is fundamentally underpins his relationship with Harris, who sees himself as a seasoned professional soldier, and his father was a corporal. He describes his father as a bloody good corporal,
yes,
or some such.
I love that line. It's great.
He has very solid opinions on what an NCO should be doing,
and yet they're all wrong, Matt. I mean, I love that. I loved him saying, "My father was a bloody good corporal," as though that's something really to be proud of. A corporal's a stepping stone to being a sergeant, but when you looked at what he did, all he did was repeat Mitch's orders or Todd's orders. So whenever Mitch said, "Okay, we're going to be moving out," Johnson would come up and say, "Right, move out." In a parody of a corporal. Well. I mean, that was just ridiculous. It was quite ironic. I think that was actually quite well done, and you really see through the weakness of Johnston as a character. He's very quick to please. He's always sucking up to Mitchell. He's beating down the other guys because he thinks that's what corporals do. Corporals beat up the lance corporals, and the lance corporals beat up the privates. That's how, he's been promoted to corporal, and that's how he behaves. Again, it's nonsense, and that's not how things work. But and he's the one actually. Well, let's not let too much out of the bag at this stage. But it's very interesting that we're getting an insight into him at an early part of the play and of the movie. It's not always the good guys who survive.
Yes.
It's not the competent ones who survive. Sometimes the most incompetent are the ones left lying there to be taken prisoner at the end.
Yeah. So I think on that we should probably move into the alley tally.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So, Rob, we had some emails before we recorded this week, and I was going to ask you about sonic deception units, and the email you sent back to us was absolute gold. We were howling at FOF HQ. So, enlighten the audience about sonic deception units in Malaya.
Well, I just replied to the email saying it's complete bollocks. It's, if I'm allowed to say that on
of course.
I think the problem is that what the producer needed was a device to bring the patrol together, to give it a rationale, and to give it something to destroy at the end. And yet there's no such thing as sonic deception. I mean, Willis Hall was in the Royal Signals. He had served as a National Service soldier in Malaya, so he had enough knowledge of how the army operates to think up this sort of device. But actually it's in the realms of science fiction, which is disappointing because he could have done so much else. There were deception. Patrols were sent out to gather information or to drop leaflets in villages and try and put the Japanese off their track and all that sort of stuff. There could have been I think a much more sensible rationale for the patrol than the sonic deception. And when you think these guys are all volunteers, well, I laugh at that as well, because anyone who's done military service knows you never volunteered for anything. Certainly not in those days. They would have been They would have been volunteered. They didn't really know. The only person who really knew how to use the equipment, which is effectively a radio, was Whitaker, Private Whitaker, who was actually brilliantly played by a young David McCallum. And that's not realistic either. So I think the problem is when you're creating a film like this, he's throwing devices in to give it some structure, but actually it detracts from the whole thing. It's too much, and it doesn't. To be honest, it doesn't work. I mean, there's a nice explosion at the end, but we could have had an explosion by some other means, a grenade setting off a rock.
They could have been a patrol sent out to destroy a bridge or something, and then they would have had to have carried explosives, that kind of thing. I suppose sonic deception just sounds cool.
Well, it probably sounded cool in the late 1950s, early 1960s, because we were preparing to go to the moon, and the Apollo missions were getting underway, and but it's artificial. And I just said, my notes when I watched the film last week, it should have been a fighting patrol, and that would have really worked well.
Yeah, it would have.
You could have actually had a fighting patrol of ragtag bunch of individuals who'd been nominated from different platoons across the battalion. They didn't really know each other. They were forced to come together, and that created uncertainty because people were trying to find their place in the pecking order. You've got Corporal Johnson, who's Richard Harris. He's bossing his way through the thing. You could actually play him really well as a man who's trying to use traditional military authority to get this team going and achieve the mission. And Richard Todd, the Sergeant Mitchell character, going out there just focused hard on surviving the mission and achieving the mission and coming back and being quite ruthless about it. As an aside, of course, Richard Todd had served in the British Army in the Second World War, and he had served in D-Day in the 7th Battalion, the Light Infantry Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. So, he was a real soldier, and you could see it
shows.
Actually. Yeah, it does show. Yeah.
It's the way he carries himself. So Harris and Mitchum obviously carry M1928 Thompsons, which is nice and correct. And they've even got the 20-round magazines. Which
odd
is nice
that they
to
had
see.
two, though. I thought that was a bit odd.
Right,
two to a platoon, patrol rather. It just seems
that is correct. That is correct. I mean, actually, at the time, the British Army and the Indian Army had a real paucity of automatic weapons relative to the Japanese. The Japanese had an automatic weapon in every section. In the British Army, we had 3 or 4 Thompsons, and you're right, straight magazines in the platoon, most of which were in platoon headquarters. They wouldn't have found their way down to the sections, although, the company sergeant major, company commander, they would have you might have had one person in a section with a Thompson. But no Bren gun, and I think that's surprising as well. There should have been a Bren gun with them, although I suppose it's understandable if they didn't have them.
It is a little bit surprising considering that they get the Japanese weapons so right. They have a Type 99 like machine gun. They all have the correct Arisaka rifles. They even have the correct hand grenades, the Type 97s.
That's right.
Yeah, the Japanese kit is amazing in this.
And it all sounded good as well. I have to say, the Japanese, when they were presented tactically and in their uniforms and their kit, it's jolly good stuff. I mean, it really is accurate stuff.
No one moves unless that light machine gun's firing.
Yeah, true. Perfect.
Which is, yeah, it's very good. That in that respect, it is.
Well, those light machine guns in the infantry sections were the biggest shock to the British and Indians and the Australians in Malaya and then in Burma later that year, because we didn't have anything like it. I mean, just as an aside, Indian battalions in 1942 had 12 Lewis guns in the battalion.
Wow.
And most of them were gathered together. They didn't even have...
That's very World War One, isn't it?
Oh, yes. It was. It took a couple of years, year and a half, to completely rebuild the British Army in India and the Indian Army as well, to a stage where it could take on a peer adversary. But the Japanese were well advanced. Of course, they'd been doing this for 10 years in China, and they'd had plenty of practice. They knew exactly how to do things. Just as an aside, of course, the British patrol all had what many people regard as Australian slouch hats. They're not. They're traditional felt hats. The Indian Army had them in the First World War. All the Gurkha regiments in the Indian Army had them. A number of Indian regiments, like the Garhwals, also had those felt hats that become synonymous with the war in the Far East. But I'm afraid the British didn't have them in Malaya. Interesting, when you look at the pictures of the play in 1959, the cast were all there in tin hats, which is correct. But we can forgive them that little...
See, I thought it was because, and I don't know if... I was going to ask everyone this later on, but is Todd meant to be Australian? Because he's doing some sort of accent.
I think he's just trying to be regional. I think he's trying not to be Richard Todd. That's what I think.
Yes, I agree with that. He's the only obvious Australian is John Mellon, who he's fabulous. I mean, he is such a stonkingly good actor.
Yes,
and I think he was a better actor than most others in this film. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, Crocodile Dundee, hallelujah, this is great stuff. But he really did. He was a great actor all the way through this. And I actually think I'd give him the acting crown. He was better than all of them.
He underplays it, doesn't he? That's what brings him above in some stakes. He underplays the role he's got there and his characterization.
Yeah, well, I thought Todd was trying to be an Aussie at times, but maybe that's just me.
I think he was just trying to do regional sergeant. I think that's what he was.
Trying to flatten his vowels.
It was really sort of all over the shop for me anyway.
Well, he can't do the classic Todd, can he? He's not Guy Gibson. He's not John Kearns. He's not standing in front of the men with his hands on his hips. It's more of an NCO role, and it's a little bit different from what his best known roles are, I suppose.
Yeah. It's nice to see the mules, actually, because I think that's a nice touch.
The mules are very good, actually. I like that. They got a lot of screen time.
Yeah, they did, actually. But I think they missed a trick here, because one of the powerful things was in the film, the instruction by Mitch to leave the mules and not to take them back. Well, that's a really important point of the film, where the reality about the mules is that the men like the mules better than they like other men. There's a really good human-animal bond going on here with mules in Burma and the Second World War, and they missed it here. So, it was an integral part of the play that the Welshman would rather have stayed there and died, our John Reese as Private Evans, than leave his mules. But it fell flat. It didn't really. The horror of leaving the mules there because they had no food to fend for themselves didn't really work. It's a great idea, but it didn't work.
Yeah, once they've done it, they never see him again. They just vanish, don't they?
Well, it's supposed to be a juxtaposition to the way that they're willing to kill a POW, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
Yes,
they'd rather allow the mules to get away safely, or at least not be killed, because a lot of this it comes back to that morality thing where there's a lot of instances where they're unwilling to actually take life. So when McLeish, Fraser's character, bayonets the Japanese scout, it's almost by accident. He turns round behind a rock and the Japanese soldier almost falls onto his bayonet to kill him. And then his compatriot, doesn't shoot the other scout that runs off. So at every juncture, and later on when Harris grabs Tojo, the Japanese scout, no one's willing to bayonet him.
Because McLeish had said before, hadn't he, that I won't bayonet another man who can't defend himself. And then in the instance, he can't even do it himself.
It's a really interesting dynamic and a really interesting conversation that really does lock this play in the film down to 1941 and 1942, because the dynamic in 1944 is completely different. And the dynamic is different because in 1941, the British are still running through their rules of war that, run through their military DNA, and the absolute imperative not to kill in cold blood, which is murder, is upheld. And I think the film is good in questioning that and questioning British behavior in 1942. But I have to say, from the historic evidence, there is very little evidence at all of the British, Australians, or Indians behaving badly to the Japanese. It was all the other way around. You don't get a sense of the enormity of how the Japanese were actually disobeying natural law and the laws of war in their treatment of prisoners. And we've just passed the 80th anniversary of the surrender of Singapore, and some of the stories that come out of the battle for Singapore itself are really just quite traumatic and terrible in the way that the Japanese treated prisoners. But of course, by 1944, the world was very different. And it wasn't as though, and that argument about the morality of fighting would not have come up. And the reason it wouldn't have come up is because British, Indians, Australians knew the Japanese wanted to die. And you would never, if there was a wounded Japanese, you'd try to kill as many as you could. If you came across a wounded Japanese who wasn't able to kill himself, the British didn't kill him off, they looked after them. And there are countless examples of wounded Japanese being looked after and actually called Tojo. That was quite interesting, actually. The standard name, both in the Australian, British, and Indian armies for Japanese soldier was Tojo. And there's some wonderful stories in the archives and the memoirs of soldiers, coming across Japanese wounded, looking after them, like the Good Samaritan, giving them a cigarette, giving them a drink, because they knew at that stage all the Japanese wanted to do was die, and they weren't a threat. Now, if the Japanese was on the ground with a grenade, or was still able to fight, he would be dispatched without mercy, because he was still a threat, and that's the point. It might have been cold blood, but it was necessary because a threat remained to the British, Australian, or American, or the Allied soldier. And that was very clear to everyone. There was very little discussion. There was very little discussion at all in all the copious memoirs of soldiers who fought through the war. They would save Japanese lives where they could, but where the Japanese were unwilling to surrender and wanted to continue fighting because they wanted to go to their heavenly paradise, they were enabled to do it. So it's a 1941-42 conversation about the morality of war, not a conversation that happened in 44-45 at all.
Right. Wow. Right.
What did we think about Bamford's interactions with Tojo and, flingers on head and all this sort of thing? What do you think about that? How do you think that represents the way that British infantry looked at the enemy and treated them, etc.?
I thought that was really good. I mean, I actually think that I think that's natural, and I think that's actually a really good reflection of how soldiers behave. Once you sit down, you look at the enemy prisoner in their eyes. We're now in cold blood. So what we're doing is we're creating human relationships. That's how humans get on. And the first thing they do is they try to find a way to communicate, and it's just an age-old story. And all the POW stories you get, that's the first step. And one of the terrors and the terrible things about some of the POW massacre stories is these relationships are created, and then all of a sudden a leader or someone goes mad and starts killing the prisoners. So there's an up and down of the emotions in terms of these human relations. I think that Bamford, I don't particularly like Laurence Harvey as an actor, I have to say. I think he overacts.
I would agree. The first half an hour I found very difficult to watch, to be honest. Partly because I knew that would never happen on a patrol or in an infantry section. He would not be allowed to go on that much.
No, he would have been slapped down very hard.
And the way he comes across with so many sort of stereotypes within the whole Cockney vibe of a barrack room lawyer, etc. Know it all. It really grates, and then thankfully it kind of mellows a little bit in the second act.
It does.
For the first half an hour, I found his performance quite jarring and a little bit grating.
I think it's playing him up. It's playing him up. So
Yes,
when he has that
it's
change of
definitely.
heart, you're like, wow, whoa, it's like the shock of it, isn't it?
Yeah. It's intentional, definitely, yeah. But he probably doesn't have the nuance that O'Toole would have had with it, I don't think.
No, I think that's right. He becomes the morally reasonable person because he's created this human relationship with Tojo and recognizes him just to be another poor soldier thrown into war against his will, perhaps with a wife and family at home. And that's all very moving. He's the defender of the moral position. The way that McLeish, who is presented as a moral person, is just too weak to take a stand. He sort of fluctuates, doesn't he? He flip-flops between one position and another. He doesn't have a solid position. He's very easily manipulated by Johnston and on the one hand and Bamford on the other. So he's a very good actor, actually.
I felt like he'd recently been promoted and he was neither one
well,
nor
he had,
the other.
I think he was promoted to Lance Corporal just. He just didn't really know where he sat in the pecking order and didn't know what he was allowed to say or think. And, that's quite a challenge. It's quite a challenge. Yeah. But I think it was very interesting that the people with the moral argument, which was presented quite well, didn't actually survive.
As Rob mentioned, I mean, we know what his fave scene is, so I think we should move on to fave scenes.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. I wanted to let you know that you can now join our supporting cast over on Patreon. As thanks for your support, you'll be able to help us pick films, submit questions for guests, have first pick on brand new and exclusive merch, and much more. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
So, Rob, as our guest, what was your fave scene? You've alluded to it many times.
The film was a bit of a curate's egg for me. I think there are things that could have been done much, much better to make it more powerful. I think it's locked in time. It's, you really, as I said earlier, you couldn't have those arguments. No one had those arguments in 1944 and 45. The moral position was very clear. One of the most powerful scenes for me was right at the end, where the Japanese patrol demonstrated their tactical superiority over the muddling Brits, who were mired in confusion and argument, both practical argument about what they should be doing next, arguing about how they should be doing it, arguing about what they should do with Tojo and the mules. And it's all very confusing and just completely chaotic in the face of this really focused, efficient, impressive Japanese military machine. And that captures it very well. The Imperial Japanese Army in 1941-42 was actually one of the most impressive armies we had ever had to fight. But then you had the fight, the denouement, and you need to watch the film, of course. But most people are killed on the British side. Of the 7, 5 are killed. The good guys and the ordinary guys are killed. So Mitch is killed. McLeish is shot by a sniper, as indeed was Mitch. And then the final denouement, the moral guy, the guy who started as a barrack room lawyer and really irritated me, Bamford, actually was the one who was desperate to continue fighting because he saw the whole purpose of going on this patrol and getting back to be, the most important thing in the mission. The only way to achieve that is by fighting. And yet Johnson, who is this big bully boy, idiot corporal, who's also very irritating, living on his stripes, forcing his stripes down everyone's mouths, was the one who wanted to surrender. And very interestingly enough, it's Corporal Johnson, so our friend Richard Harris, who surrenders with a white silk scarf taken from one of the Japanese killed. And it's poor old Bamford who keeps on firing, destroys the sonic array equipment, which brings down a landfall and kills Bamford himself and some others. So that's quite a powerful part of the film, actually. It's just because you got the right moral position doesn't mean you're going to survive. And then the little scrounger, the looter, Private Whittaker, who's quite a weak character. I think they got the sequence and all that very wrong because there's no way that the 3 weeks of war in Malaya, he would have had access to any Japanese equipment at all. That was all really strange and artificial. They could have done it better. He could have been a tea leaf. That's a better way of presenting Whittaker. But anyway, he survived as well. So the two really weak links in this whole section are the ones that survive. I think that's a really powerful thing to leave the audience on. It's a morality tale, but it's not a hero story. It's not the good guys win and get out the end. I mean, the irony, perhaps this isn't spoken about, of course, is that actually the two people who are going to have it the hardest are Johnson and Whittaker, because they're going into an uncertain captivity of the Japanese. And I think more could have been done about that. I mean, that's one of the failings of the film. But actually, that was my fave bit. Johnson surrendering at the end and, cowering in front of the Japanese. And then the Japanese pulling Whittaker out of the grass and laughing at him and bullying him as they had done with Tojo.
Links in perfectly to my favourite scene is where Whittaker is captured by those. I think it's the same number of men who make up the cast of the movie initially.
Yes.
Like 5 men or 6 men, and they're all around him with their bayonets. And obviously he's been portrayed as this weakling, and he's got Tojo's water bottle around his neck, so he's thieved. And then they're berating him in Japanese. Whittaker doesn't know what they're saying. They're showing him the water bottle, obviously angry that he's got it. And it harkens back to a piece of dialogue for me that Bamford said to McLeish was, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I hope you don't end up with men like us if you get captured.
Oh, yes.
It's the arc starts again.
He also says something like, I hope they kill your brother, doesn't he? At some point.
That's quite powerful, actually, yes. Yeah.
And you just feel that, Whittaker doesn't understand what they're saying. He's exactly like Tojo, and he's got this despondent look that Tojo had all the time. And you think, well, the arc starts again. But we know, veterans would have known at the time watching it in the cinema, we know those Japanese soldiers are not going to give Whittaker half the thrift and talking that Tojo got. And I think it's a really powerful ending to the movie. It crams in all of its arc at the end. I think it crams in all of everything it wants to say in that last 5 minutes. But and it's just a great turn from McCullum. He plays this sniveling little weakling really effectively, and you feel sorry for him because you're like, oh gosh, if it had been McLeish, he's this tough Scot. He could have, he would have shown the Japs, I'm not scared of you sort of thing, even if it was all face. But Whittaker's just going to crumble. Yeah. And I also felt that about Johnson as well. I think the minute Johnson gets a bayonet put at him, he'll crumble as well. It's all power. It's all sort of deconstructing the characters there. But it's a great little ending. Matt, what's your favourite scene?
Well, before I mention mine, I do like, the Whittaker character. I think his arc's really good because he goes from being the radio op, the signalman. He's shown as he knows what he's doing, but he's a little bit incompetent. He warns Todd that they'll, if they keep putting out signals, that the Japanese will be able to find them, etc. But he doesn't seem to really push back against that. And then later on, when he hears that Japanese voice in the music, he starts to crumble a little bit there. And then finally in the mine, when they're called to surrender by the Japanese over the radio, he really does crumble there, and he ends up shooting Tojo. I think he has a really strong arc, and I think as we've said, McCallum's performance is a really, really good one. It's not the biggest part in the film, obviously, but I think he underpins that morality and the backbone of men in a situation like that. I think he plays that quite well because he's portrayed as the newest, the youngest soldier. He talks about being at Kettering, etc., and in training and so forth. But the ending actually really brings it home to me because my granddad was with the Recce Corps in Singapore. He surrendered with the rest of the garrison, and Richard Harris is the uncertainty in his face, and especially the uncertainty in Whittaker's face. Yeah, that brought it home for me. But my favorite scene actually is where Harris and Todd are on their little reconnoiter after the chaps have gotten into the mining office of the tin mine in the hut. They go through the mine a little bit to see if there's another route out, which militarily makes sense. That's it's a sensible thing to do. Find out ways of leaving an area without going the way you came. But there's a lot of building of both of their characters in that scene where Harris kind of ribs Todd about losing his patrol, and Todd loses his temper, and it underpins Harris's eagerness to please a little bit as well, because once they get back into the hut and the situation becomes a little bit more serious, he acquiesces and stops riling against Mitch and says, right, he follows orders then. And I think that's a really interesting, it's one of the more subtle developments of characters in the film. With Harvey, we get that first 20-minute tirade of just shouting and mercilessly mocking everyone in the patrol. And his character's developed through that kind of irritating, just being abrasive with everyone, basically.
But setting you up to not like him, aren't they? That's
exactly, and that's the whole point of the character and the characterization. But with Todd and Harris's characters, it's a little bit more nuanced. So I appreciated that in that little sequence where they go through the jungle and probably pass that same rock 4 or 5 times, and those same 2 trees, and they go through that little tunnel, which is it's very Doctor Who of the early 60s, isn't it? That it's very
Scooby-Doo with the same
paper mache rocks, and I was impressed they had that much standing water, to be honest. But that was my favorite scene. I found it quite tricky to pick, to be honest, but the cigarette case scene, which we've already talked about, was up there for me because I liked McLeish's flip-flopping. I liked the arguments that they were putting forward from both perspectives, and the way it flip changed when he said, well, I gave him the cigarettes. Maybe he bought the case. I like that element too. But I think that the growth of the Todd Harris relationship, although the actors didn't get on, as we say, was quite good. I like that scene.
Yeah, it was good. So that was our favorite scene. So moving on. When we have a guest, sometimes our Patreons can put questions to our guest. And this week we have a couple from some of our Patreons. So Thomas McCall wants to ask Robert, did the 14th Army consider or describe themselves as the Forgotten Army during the course of the war, or is that a post-war invention? And the second question he had was, have you seen any contemporary reaction from the men of 14th Army reacting to the 1945 film Objective Burma?
In both cases, yes. So in the Forgotten Army, the men of the 14th Army, or the British Army in the Far East, and you just need to step back and say, actually, fighting the Far East, we had troops, regiments, battalions, regiments, formations of the British Army, as well as those of the Indian Army. They were not the same thing. But in terms of the British Army, yes, from 1943, we get quite a bit of evidence that the men of the British servicemen serving in the Far East regard themselves as forgotten. And it's essentially because by the time the British newspapers reach India and then get to the border of India, into Arakan or into Assam and Manipur, they're 6 to 8 weeks old. And when the boys read them, there's nothing in there about their deprivations and their work and so on, which is probably a good thing, because until then, it was just a story of relentless disaster. But it was one of the things that Mountbatten, and they started calling themselves the Forgotten Army then. So when Mountbatten turned up in October, November 1943, the first thing he told the men was, "You're not the Forgotten Army. No one's even heard of you." But he did put in place some really quite significant communication efforts, newspapers and troops radio and all that sort of stuff, to bind the troops' morale together for the first time in that respect. And he was very effective. Mountbatten doesn't get a good press always from the Second World War, but actually for his time as Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, he really did come out top. So that's the 14th Army. The men regarded themselves as forgotten from as early as late 1942, early 43. Different story for the Indians, of course, because they were much closer to home. And there was very little support for them as well until Mountbatten turned up and started treating everyone equally, which is a really important point. The second question about Objective Burma, yes, there were riots, I understand, or close riots in cinemas across Calcutta in 1945, wow. when the film was, when Objective Burma was shown, which indicated that the Americans single-handedly were defeating the Japanese in Burma. I understand Objective Burma quite well. I understand in the sense that it was a film made for Americans to bring them up to speed with what their boys were doing in the Far East. And it's really important to remember that there were many more Americans fighting in Southeast Asia Command, Far East, than there were Brits. There were about 100,000 Brits in Southeast Asia Command, but 280,000 Americans. So although the American combat effort, the Northern Combat Area Command, commanded by General Stilwell, which was basically building the Lido Road over the mountains down to Myitkyina and fighting their way down there with two Chinese armies at the same time was arguably less of a military effort than that going on in Infal Kahima 944 and so on. It was equally significant. In fact, it was working directly to achieve the Allied strategic aims in the Far East, which was to support China. Yeah. So I don't begrudge the Americans for making that film, because it's a very good film, actually. They were presenting a pretty credible story about what Americans were doing.
We enjoyed it.
Yeah, we liked it. Yeah.
It's a very good film, and you can't create a film that covers everything. It's not a documentary. This was looking at the Lido Road. And
I suppose you could say that it was more of a failing of the British film industry in not making a film about the 14th Army or the Indian Army or that area of the war at all.
That's absolutely right. I mean, one of the great absences is combat photography. There's a little of cinematography. There's a little bit of combat cinematography, which is all available, increasingly available now. Kikuchi and the Imperial War Museum is digitizing it slowly, and it's going online. It's fabulous stuff, but there was very, very little of it. And of course, no one put it into a play or a film, and there never has been. And there jolly well should be. We should have a band of brothers.
Oh, I agree.
They're based around the 14th Army, and there's quite an extraordinary number of things that you could, stories that you could tell. But so that's hopefully both questions answered.
Yeah. Well, we have one more. Fantastic. I mean, we hope that answers your question, Tom. And we have one more question from Mary Brazier, and she asks, I've been wondering about the different tone of many films set in the Asian theatre, Yesterday's Enemy, for example. They often seem to have more ambiguous tone than those on the European front. Did the experiences of veterans of that theatre have any influence on that? And does it reflect society's different views?
Thank you, Mary. What a complex question. I would simply say that I think what the war in the Far East threw up in terms of a narrative or a conversation for everyone to chew on at the time was the morality tale that the films presented. And you don't get that in any of the European war movies. The European war movies are all lots of bangs and bluster and bayonets and heroes and all that sort of stuff. There are very few, maybe except for Target for Tonight and a few others, that are really seriously thinking films around what we're trying to do in Europe during war. And this film and the play and then the film does try to set out those moral ambiguities in a clear way. And I think that's what makes the difference. And it does set it apart from other films. But as I said earlier, that film relates to the early stages of the fighting. By 1944-45, Mary, those conversations were not being had, and because they weren't necessary, and you couldn't make that film in that time in 1944 because it would have been, it wouldn't have worked. But yes, I think there is a very distinct difference. Objective Burma is a different film because it is a war hero story, elevating the American effort on the Lido Road, and that's fair enough because the Americans did do a fabulous job, and without the Americans, Burma would never have been retaken, and we've all forgotten that. But it was a very different type of film to the ones that you're describing. Yes,
it's interesting. Sorry, Robert. I think it's interesting that the two major films we have that cover the British experience in the Far East is Yesterday's Enemy and this one, and they're both tales of morality and men in war.
They're both exactly the same.
It's really interesting.
Well, so is Bridge Over the River Kwai. That's another morality story, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is.
Very interesting.
I think. I wonder if it's an element of filmmakers not really understanding the nature of the war in the Far East.
I completely agree. And I think that's, if we go back to my first comments, I think that really undermines the film for me. This entire concept. In fact, I made a note of it. They just don't. He doesn't understand Bushido. If he understood, if the producer had understood Bushido,
Norman,
it would have been Norman. Yeah, it would have been a very different and a much more powerful play because, as we said right at the start, without repeating ourselves, that jeopardy and so on would have been really, really marked. And the background to this conversation about is it right to kill in cold blood as it is in hot blood? How do you, where do you draw the line? How do you manage prisoners and all that sort of stuff? Would have been much easier to make.
Yeah.
That sort of question, for instance, never arose in the desert because, famously, it was considered a gentleman's war, and less so in Europe, but certainly when you were engaging with Japanese. And of course, in 1959, there can't have been any Brits who didn't understand how horrible that war had been, and how terrible the Imperial Japanese Army had treated not just its military prisoners of war, but the people who they subjugated in the process of taking over this new part of their empire. It wasn't just soldiers, it was civilians, and a very, very large number of Indians, Tamils, and so on died. Many more Indians died on the Burma Railway than did British Australians. And that would have been known in 1959 and 1960, and yet it wasn't presented sufficiently well in the film to make it a really powerful film. So I think this is a film that is 75 or 80% there, but it's missing some really key parts that would have made it a great film.
Agreed.
A lack of understanding.
Yeah. So that sways into final thoughts perfectly. When I think we know what Robert feels. Matt, have you your final thoughts first?
I enjoyed it for its limitations. It's studio bound. Perhaps some of the casting didn't get on as well as they could have done. The cinematography isn't bad. It's not the most experimental or skilled.
A bit flat at places.
Yes,
lighting is nice though. I'll give them that. The lighting is.
It is. The lighting is good. And for being for being studio bound, it isn't too bad really.
The sounds and the bangs were great. I was really impressed with that final battle. They got all that fabulously right.
Yeah.
Even the pings from the bullets and the ricochets.
Very nice.
The echo in the tin mine was good. I did think at the beginning though, when they were doing the sonic deception stuff, that it was a little bit echoey for a studio. It sounded a little bit echoey. They could have done with deadening a little bit there. That's just something I noticed. But I enjoyed it. I liked the performances, most of them anyway. Even Harvey's grew on me eventually. I appreciated what he was going for and how the character was supposed to develop. So I did enjoy it, yeah.
It's a film of two halves for me. I much prefer the second half of the movie because it feels more like what I assume the play would be like. I couldn't find any filmed version of the play to compare.
No, I had looked too. And
there was a 1979
it's probably in an archive somewhere if we're lucky.
Somewhere, but but it that felt much more like a theatre piece. You had men performing front on. They weren't moving. It felt very like that had been blocked out like a theatre piece. So I'd much prefer the second half. The first half, you're learning about the characters, but I think you could have probably done that a little bit quicker.
Yeah,
and maybe had a little bit more with Tojo, because he's giving an absolute, saying everything with his face, because he doesn't speak many lines. He doesn't have many lines in the movie, but he's doing it's an absolute powerhouse performance of a scared man.
Yeah.
I just thought that was absolutely fabulous. He's one of
the best actors in the film, I think.
Oh yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah,
he and John Mallon, I think, take it away for me. And they play bit parts. Well, Takaki doesn't, but he's very impressive.
I also think it's interesting just to see Todd and Harris bounce off one another, even though they didn't get on outside of the film. I still think they work well off each other as actors. I wish more people would think of this film when they think of Richard Todd, because it is a completely different type of role for him. He's not playing a famous person. Up at this point in Dan Bosses, he played Guy Gibson. He would play I think it's
Kerins.
Yeah. So it's a different role for him, NCO type role. But as we said earlier, I just feel it's a little bit too penned in. It could have been made more film-like with them going through a jungle. As I said at the start, I think it would have added more tension to the whole film. But if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it, because I think it's a good companion piece to Yesterday's Enemy if you enjoy that sort of movie. And if you like a war movie that doesn't have a lot of war in it, this is a good one, because it's more about men in war.
If you like a morality piece as well.
Than war itself.
And it's one of the few depictions of the Far East.
Yeah.
Although it's a flawed one, it's one of the few.
Fantastic. So I think that probably rounds us out for this week. Robert, we want to thank you for coming on. A consummate professional as always. If you haven't
It's been a blast, really has.
Yes. Oh, I mean, if you knock history books on the head, you've got a career in film reviewing because you've done a stand-up job. If you haven't read War of Empires, please seek it out. It's a tome de force, as we like to say around here. Catch us next week when we'll be covering another war movie for your delectation. So we'll catch you next week, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thanks very much for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.